today I will be the moderator for our second session. So before I start, please kindly turn on your camera since the attendance will be monitored through your screen appearance. Okay, so for this session, we have three PIC. They are me, Sharifatul Latifah, and Titis Mega. So if there is any problem, you may communicate it to the PIC1. And please look for their name in the attendance list with the name PIC1. Okay, now we are going to have session with the title Nation-State Nationalism in International Relation and the Integration of Europe. This course will show you the early stages of nation-state concept up to this modern era, alongside with the history of European integration. This particular theme will give you a deeper understanding of how various sovereign countries with their own interests are integrated as a single entity. And this session will be provided by Mr. Andi Ahmad Basith Dir MIS, lecturer of Department of International Relations di Diponegoro University. Thank you, the operator. Wait. Okay, so first thing first, I'm going to read Mr. Basith's CV for you. Thank you, operator. Mr. Basith is a graduate of International Relations Gajah Mada University for the undergraduate program. He then continued his master program at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, specializing in European integration and graduated in 2015. He also went to the University of Santiago de Compostela, Spain in October 2014. With specialization in international politics and European studies. He is now pursuing his PhD in political science in Philipps Universität Marburg, Germany, with specialization in cognitive in international relations and is scheduled to go next month. So as I mentioned before, okay, we can scroll down a little bit. So as I mentioned before, he is currently the lecturer at International Relations of Diponegoro University since 2015. Some of the classes that Mr. Basith teaches are European Studies, Australian Foreign Policy, and Political Behavior. Therefore, today's class is very related to his expertise in European Union politics and international regimes. He also has published some journals of his work with the collaboration with other lecturers here in our department. Okay, sorry. Well, Mr. Basith has been receiving so many scholarships since the beginning of his academic career. Okay, scroll down a little bit. Again, operator. Okay, yes. So Mr. Basith has been receiving scholarships since the beginning of his academic career, and for the PhD, he received research grant to go to Germany. He also has professional association with Indonesian Political Scientists Association, Indonesian International Relations Association, and Indonesian Epistemic Community for European Studies from 2016 up until now. I think that's all I can tell you from his CV, and Mr. Basith is already here. Good morning, Mr. Basith. How are you today?
Good morning or good afternoon. I'm very well. Thank you very much. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. Okay,
No problem.
So without further ado, I'm going to invite Mr. Basith here to share his knowledge and insight about European integration. And Mr. Basith, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. So before I begin, I would like to extend a few thank yous to the committee, of course, the hardworking committee headed by my colleague, one of my best friends, Mas Satwika Paramasatya atau Satya. And then I would like to also extend my gratitude to the committee, to the students, to whoever it is contributing to the creation of this event. Thank you very much. Very wonderful, very well executed, and I'm honored, I'm excited to be invited in this very program. I would like to say hi to the participants, a lot of people here. Some of you are studying with us in the Department of International Relations, and I'm not quite sure if we have foreign participants. If you are from abroad, hello and welcome, and thank you very much for joining in. So before I begin, I need to explain my sort of like situation. Like I'm currently in a hotel room doing a lot of other administrative things, And I don't mean to be romantic by having this sort of like dim lights, but that's just the best light I could ever possibly have now. So please excuse my sort of like very private background back there. I hope you would understand. All right. So when I was invited um, to talk today, I was informed that um, uh, this summer course is about your international relations, and it's also about, to some extent, it's also talking about Indonesia or anything like developing countries and whatnot. So I'm trying to formulate those dimensions in my head and think about what should I talk about that is also relevant to the things that I know. And for the past years, I think I have been trying to focus on um, European integration courses like readings, writings, anything about the European Union. I'm trying to be interested in, and I thought maybe it's interesting to talk about integration because it is still part of the international relations discourses, and also maybe to be talking a bit about Indonesia or developing countries pertaining to that very phenomenon. So what I'm trying to do here, I'm just going to be talking about, as mentioned before by Cynthia as our moderator, I'm going to be talking about the nation state. I'm going to be talking about the European integration. Probably in the last few pages of my presentation, I will try to address the integration dimension with its relevancy with developing countries, so to speak. Okay, so I'm not sure how this works. I'm just gonna try to share my screen. Can someone make me a moderator, or I think co-moderator, co-host or something? Because I need to be the co-host to be able to share my screen. All right, I'm the co-host now. I'm just gonna be careful not to share. Let me just close down some of my like windows here so my secrets are safe with me. Just gonna go share. Okay, do I have that correctly? All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Right. So let me drink for a moment. Welcome to my presentation. I'm going to be talking or sharing about the nation state and sort of like the dimensions of nation states and the European integration. I understand that we need to be engaged one another. So please, if you have a question or anything you would like to like flow, then please feel free to just raise your hand and I will acknowledge you and I will give the screen to you. Okay, but until then, I'm just gonna share some information about my material today. The nation state and the European integration. So it's a concept. There's a concept of nation state in there, and part of this concept is used by the European integration, and we will see. Can you see my screen because it's not moving here?
We're still in the first slide, sir.
Okay. This is really bad. Wait a second. I'm gonna stop the video because it's, wait, it's different. Okay, I'm not sharing screen anymore. Am I?
You're not.
Okay. Just wait a second, okay? I'm just gonna share my desktop then. Okay, can you see my desktop now?
Yeah.
And my presentation?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're back in the slide one.
Okay, you see it now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so when you talk about nation state, a lot of social scientists think a nation state are reconstructed. A nation state is a concept that is socially and politically made. So I would like to give you a quote, right, from Massimo di Esaglio, when their group, as we know, like Italy is just a new state. It's not like a new country happening since in the 16th century, for instance. It's a result of a social construction during the 80s, the last 19th centuries, 18th to 19th centuries. And one of the guys creating Italy, having created Italy, he said, we must now create Italians. Like, this is a very unique quote, because just by having this very short sentence, we understand that it is the state that they create. And then now there's a tendency, there is a statement that signifies the citizens of the state will also be waiting for such a creation. So this is very relevant, I think, with our theme today, where we're going to be talking about the concept of nation state. So, okay. Okay, the concept of nation state. When we talk about the concept of nation state, we are basically talking about two things. First of all, the nation, of course, and then we have the concept as state. Now, in order to understand what is the concept of the nation state, I would like to sort of like dive into the very definition, or at least the very short definition of what is nation and what is state. How do we perceive what a nation is, and how do we define what state really is? Maybe after understanding them quite differently, each within their very own concept, we could have a very good grasp on what is it called, the concept of the nation state. Now let's take a look at nation first. What do we mean by saying nation, for instance? Okay, so what is nation? Here you can see it's a group of individuals. I'm sorry. It's a group of individuals forming larger groups or community, and then they identify themselves as community or society. So let's imagine just a small group of people going to the second point, where they have similarities in terms of ancestor, it's their lane, it's their race to some extent, of course, and they share the very same history, language, and culture, and they live together side by side, and they are forming a bigger, larger groups of people that we call eventually a community or a society. So if we want to understand the very basic concept of nation, we can see from this very simple definition, where people with similar backgrounds, so to speak, they need to live together and they form a community. What is really interesting then, right, according to Renan is like, I mean, like, if you're interested in this concept or the discussion of nation and state, then you'd be interested in reading some of Renan's works as well. And Renan said, these people putting so much time in tracing back the similarities between them in terms of ancestral land, race, history, and so on and so forth. But later on, they will forget about this because some new serious social issues will occur whenever they have formed their community or society. Okay. And that is why, according to Benedict Anderson, for instance, they call it a nation is it's a political and cultural project based on social institution. What it means, once you have a person sharing similar traits with other people, and then they start forming a community or a society, and that's going to be the most important part first, but later on, as they excel, as they advance as a community, they start finding some other needs of them. They start funding some other more important things as a community, and that's when they need, or at least they feel the need, they desire for a more orderly manner society. That's when they begin to forget what is the land, what is the rest, what is the history, and they start looking something more meaningful like social institutions. They start forming governments, they start forming representatives, they start forming any other social institutions that they think could help them, right, in in becoming a society that is more of a high quality and can be reliable to solve their daily social needs and problems. Okay, and then that's basically a nation, right? And if you take a look at state, for instance, I think it's going to be much easier when we talk about state and we want to understand what is state per se, because the definition of state, I think, quite is just quite transparent out there, especially us learning or teaching international relations. Then we would understand that we can at least use two basic international standard when we want to have a definition of state. The first one is, of course, the Treaties of Westphalia. It's not necessarily defining what is state in general modern form, but at least Westphalia, or at least the year 1648 is widely regarded as the era, as the period that paved the way for the birth of modern state or society. Okay, and then if you ask further, what is the more elaborative manner in defining a state, and then you could also have, in much modern sense, the Montevideo Convention in 1933, where some of the definition, some of the physical standards, and some of a more, let's just put it, some clearer definition is there, and establishing or measuring what constitutes a state is, for instance. So let's take a look very quickly in the Treaties of Westphalia, for instance. Okay, the Treaties of Westphalia is important in terms of remembering what is the definition of state, because first, the Treaties of Westphalia ended the overarching power of empire. As we all understand, before the birth of modern nations with borders, with sovereignties, with recognitions from other states, we only knew the concept of empire back then. And then more often than not, this empire was ruled by religious superiority or domination, right? And then eventually, because of the Treaties of Westphalia, notice I said treaties in there because we have actually two treaties, peace treaties, right? Munster and the other one, and then they give like they ended the overarching power of empire, and then they give birth to states in like modern sense in that time that people never knew. Like, we have to recognize the border, we have to recognize the government. Small communities and entities actually have sovereignties and have the rights for self-determination, and so on and so forth. And then I think it's also important that the Treaties of Westphalia sort of like recognized, or at least gave permission or give the allowance to this newly established territory to defend themselves, to use the force. Hypothetically, theoretically, they're allowed to do it, and it's part of effort to sort of like defend your territory. So what it implies, or at least what the message conveyed by this, is that it's very important now that we recognize the territory, things that did not exist before. Because if the Roman Empire liked you, they will come to you no matter what, for instance, and they're just gonna conquer you, right? But after this Treaties of Westphalia, at least there's a new concept introduced to the white world that, hey, you cannot do that. You know, there is now what we call border, there's no what we call sovereignty. And if you mess with it, probably they're going to defend themselves. Probably they will also retaliate. So that's the basic idea. It seems to be like obsolete now and we take it for granted. But looking back then, I think 3 or 4 centuries ago, that's just something new, you know, like out of the culture of colonization, you know, out of the culture of like just expanding and conquering and those kind of things. The fact, the idea that sort of like some of the most some of the most powerful states in Europe, you know, are able to come to a conclusion and concluded a treaty or treaties in this manner that recognize this is just really giving or paving the way for the birth of the state, right? And later on, this concept of state or statehood got sharpened, so to speak, in 1933. As I mentioned before, we have the Montevideo Convention. We have a lot of articles with Montevideo. Then I'm just going to take the first article of it, where they specifically define what really constitutes a state. You know, for instance, they have permanent population. They have for sure defined territory. You know, they have government and they have capacity to enter into relations with the other states or other states. Now, I would like to show you that population in here is really the focus on our lecture today. So it is the population that have been the nation so far. So if we have the concept of the nation state, we have the people living in the country, in a certain country, and that people are the ones that we call nation. Okay. Now we have states or countries in the world that have like multiple nations living as their population, and that's really more common situation, I would say. But in some other instances, there will be also states with probably just one single nation as their entire population. Okay. Now, you would probably disagree by me saying one nation, one single state with one single nation, as you might probably perceive that the nation I'm about to show you actually consists of multiple nations as well. But let me show you what I'm talking about later on. Before that, I would like to go to the so when you combine what is nation and state, so this is the very basic definition of nation state. It's a bounded territory inhabited by one or multiple nations who decide to form collective societies with certain objectives and aims achieved under unitary political and civil institutions. So as mentioned before, like from one simple community sharing similarities in the backgrounds, ancestors, probably races, languages, and so on and so forth. And then they live together and they feel the need to form like a larger community, combining more communities living with them. And then later on, it's getting bigger. They feel the need, right, to have a unitary political and civil institutions to solve their daily problems, to survive, to advance together as a community. And that's why eventually they form a state. So that's basically, if you want to see a nation state, I think it's best to see it from two different separated definitions first before going in and combining them together. for instance. Now, nation-state relations, by then, of course, there are more nations than states. Okay, that's the basic understanding that a lot of social scientists, political scientists understand by now, that one state could be comprising of more than one nation. All right, but we also have states just with one single nation as their population. That could be happening, as I will demonstrate later. But the idea is, we understand now that states are probably having more than one nation living in their territories, their population. So that makes it very easily to understand that we have more nations in the world than states. For instance, if we have like 200-ish number of states, then rest assured we would be having more nations than just 200s. Okay, and the other thing that we need to know, I think it's quite important, is that as nations are the one forming the state, right? It's like really their decisions to sort of like, let's create civil union, let's create like unitary political bodies and institutions. So we need to understand that it is actually the population, the nations, that are moving towards everything and trying to reach the advancement. State is just there to facilitate, but really the evolving organization of the state is really the nations within. All right. So that being said, for instance, it is back to the very first tenet that I informed you before, that state, nation and nation state is a reconstructed form of social and political sciences. So I think it's quite safe to assume that nations, along with their states, are gonna evolving constantly, and they're gonna go through a lot of social reconstructions, and that should make them not a permanent phenomenon in international relations. As we already have witnessed in the last at least 100 years, we see states come and go, right? We see like nations and the states are created, are disbanded, are extended, or are reducing their territorial, so to speak. The only reason why this happens is because the nations, the populations as their nations, are constantly evolving, trying to find the best construction, social and politically speaking, for their own interests and achievements. So we could have a case, a country where they cease, right? For instance, Yugoslavia, right? We used to have a country called Yugoslavia where the country consisted of multiple nations. We have Serbian living in there, we have Croatians living in there, we have Bosnians, and so on and so forth, which is now has become like multiple countries, each with their own nations, for instance. So we have that instances. We have Soviet Union, right? We have Germany, who have been like two countries in the past, but now we have like one, countries that separate. We have the northern part and the southern part. We have countries that they dissolute and recreate smaller part of countries. This is not because all the nations living within those countries want it that way. So instead of like, as opposed to like seeing the states that want it, like in a concept, very nation state kind of thing, we try to look closer beyond the government and sees what is really the dynamics in that country that allowed sort of like reconstruction happen. And I think the sharp and the best way to understand it is probably by looking from the nations that live within the country. Okay, so nation can be inhabiting like states, right? So like one state can consist of like multiple nations, as I told you before, but like we also have states that are of one single entity of a nation, right? And again, you may disagree, we can discuss about it later, but for instance, we have a country like Japan where we have the nations, the Japanese as a one nation living as the citizen, right? And some of you think because Japan, of course, has been also a product of social reconstruction in the past that had been uniting like a lot of traditional kingdoms and peoples and local rulers and warlords, those kind of things. And it's a very good chance, there's a very good chance that they also come actually from different nation. As a matter of fact, I think Besley wrote at one time that really the ancestors of the Japanese are people with fair skin like what they have now, with sort of like steep facial features like what they would have these days as well. But what is really interesting, I think William Besley said years and years ago, thousands of years ago, people inhabiting the islands of Japan right now are people with blue eyes. You know, they are Asian but having blue eyes. So in that sense alone, you would think, hey, they're a different nation. But I would like to think of them as one nation, like one country, one nation, as I would like when I see or perceive the state of Israel, for instance. And again, Jewish, of course, like they have multiple races as well. I think they were not an expert on it, but again, just to have an example of a country having like one single nation, and I would like to make Israel as an example as well. And these are different. These countries are different. For instance, with let's just say other states that happen to have multiple nations living in them, okay? Like we have the United Kingdom. As the name dictates, it's United Kingdom. So like the project is uniting some kingdoms. And by that virtue, we could have, for instance, so what are the nations living in the United Kingdom? We first of all have, of course, like English people, gentlemen, very proper. And then we have Scottish people as a nation as well, if you would. And then we have Irish people, of course, who has been seeking independence from the United Kingdom of the British Empire since like years ago. And lastly, don't forget about the Welsh people. So like even in a country, this small country like the United Kingdom, we already have like 4 different nations living as the same citizen of that country, the United Kingdom. All right. So this tells us that a country can be consisting of one single nation, like Japan, for instance, but we also have country with simply more than one nations. Other examples would include France. Okay. When we talk about France, well, white people, you know, bule, we call them in Indonesia, but who would have guessed, for instance, like they also are of different nations. Like, are they Burgundy? Like, are they Normandys, or are they Golds? Are they like a lot of different traditional European nations as well? Okay, so what are they actually? We call them as France, but years and years ago, hundreds of years ago, there was no France. There was just small little kingdoms in what we perceive as modern France these days. Okay, now we have Indonesia as well as the host of this program. Indonesia is very proud to be a diverse country, as you may understand very well. This is the flag of Indonesia, red and white. And this is the map of Indonesia. As you can see, we have like 5 very large islands, okay? And then we have like other thousands of islands that are inhabited or that are not inhabited. And sometimes, sadly, the only reason we understand that we have that island is when we are on the verge of losing them, because some other countries are claiming the island. But the idea is that Indonesia is a very diverse country with also multiple nations. Okay, for instance, if you want to go from like the left hand side of your screen, and you would have the island of Sumatra, followed closely by Java, and then we have Kalimantan, Sulawesi, and so on and so forth, until Papua on the eastern part of Indonesia. And each of this region or island actually has different nations as well, so to speak, right? So the identity is probably like this. Okay, if you want to look at Sumatra Island, we have Malayu people in there, and then we have Javanese nation living and inhabiting the Java Island for like centuries. We have people in Kalimantan as well, different nations, different tribe. We have Bugis people, we have people from Bali, we have people from Nusa Tenggara, for instance, and we have people from Maluku. And don't forget, our younger or probably youngest brother these days is people from Papua. And if you look at the physical feature of Papua, they are clearly the people of what has been described so far when we learn sociology as Negroid people or the black people of Indonesia, where they have the feature of like having black skin, like curly hair, like thickened lips and those kind of things. And just by looking this, we already tell that Papua is different people and different region to the rest of Indonesia. But that is a very sad statement, because if you notice, I said to the rest of Indonesia, as though the rest of Indonesia are equally the same race and probably ancestor as well. But truth to be told, the rest of Indonesia is also having like very diverse entities and identities and histories in the past as far as like nation is concerned. So Indonesia, I would like to consider, and a lot of people I think definitely consider Indonesia as a state with multiple nations inhabiting the island. Okay, even multiple products like the one we have here from Malaysia as well. If you understand the joke, then probably you're Indonesian or Malaysian. Okay, so this is Garuda Indonesia, and this is the very tool that we use to unite the people. Okay, so we have a concept of state, and the state needs the population, and the population is coming from different backgrounds, different nations, and we need a tool, a social reconstruction, to sort of like bring people together under one table, for instance. And we use Garuda Pancasila proudly, sort of like holding what it seems to be a ribbon, right? And then on it is written Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. Those of you don't know, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika is like it's the principle of our country, and it says that berbeda-beda tetapi tetap satu, like united in diversity, so to speak. So that's really like the whole idea of Indonesian nation state, and how we are trying to be together these days, or for the past, let's say, 50 years, for instance. Okay, now we're talking about European integration. Having understood quite a bit about the concept of nation state, let's take a look at the concept of European integration. So it's quite the same. When we talk about European integration, let's just imagine an attempt to integrate nations like from a very small community going around with other small community. They live side by side, they share ancestors, they share history in the past, they share probably religious perspective, they share probably just some idealism, they share a language, for instance, and so on and so forth. And then they create like what we call sort of like larger communities, which later on turn into states. And if you bring these states together and you try to integrate them, European states, I mean, then we have European integration. So really the basic fuel for this integration is that they're trying to bring that's an attempt, a social construction that is trying to bring politics and economic similarities to that the European nations had, so that they can be together and forming sort of like larger, more powerful, more solid, more influential political entity. Okay, and the idea of European integration is not something new, you know, like the idea of having uh, the visions of having a Europe integrated has been like shared by like a lot of people, a lot of European thinkers. If you're familiar by these names, then maybe you probably have read some of their works, but here I highlight like the most prominent works that are recognized in trying to bring Europe closer and together. We have Richard Kalergi, who has been an advocate of pan-Europea, and I think the idea was like to have like a bigger Europe united, not just like the united Europe that we currently have these days, but at least he's trying to bring like the eastern and in the western part of Europe like going together. And we know that it's not happening. It failed miserably. As a matter of fact, right after the idea of pan-Europea, we have the World War, the first one and the second one, two times, all taking places but in Europe. So you can see like the pan-Europea is really not working at the time. And it was supported by Konrad Adenauer and Georges Pompidou, which had no influence, I would say, because it's failed. And then we have the Aristide Briand with his proposal, but I think right in the middle of advancing it, like he passed away. And then we have other one, Charles de Gaulle, you know, the Europeanist, the leader of the of France, and he's been very ambitious with uniting Europe. He's been always thinking about Europe being one of the best, you know, continent, and they should be together and those kind of things. But again, European federalists of Charles de Gaulle faced many challenges, which later on was addressed at some point. But you know, this reservation between the way he sees Europe and the way like the rest of the European nations want to be united in a certain way continues to play like role, continues to exist even until 1960s, 70s to 80s, for instance. But let's just continue for a moment. I'll be going back to Charles de Gaulle later. But here's the really the idea that eventually worked, not work like successfully in the beginning of it, but as you guys understand, we have Robert Schuman and we have Jean Monnet, and these are some figures that have been considered to be the fathers of Europe, you know, in terms of like uniting Europe, in terms of like proposing how Europe should be united and what are the social reconstructed reasons to unite or to be united for. And I think we need to understand that for the most part, that ambitious project would be deriving from some people or some figures, two of which are this gentleman that we're seeing on our screen. Okay, especially like Robert Schuman, where he makes like the Schuman Declaration in 1950, urging the France and the German to be together under one specific collaboration. Okay, so give me a second. I think I need to I just need to, I don't know, like my laptop slow bit, and I hope. Okay, let's just continue. I'm sorry if the lighting is not as good as before, because like I had to kill one light in order for me having my laptop like charged. But let's just continue. Um, so it was the Schuman Declaration 1950 to be the core foundation of what we are knowing today as the European Union or European integration. And here it was the idea to encourage the nations of France and Germany to be together and to cooperate together. Okay. There are reasonings behind the European integration. Okay. And these are some reasons that I would always offer very quickly to understand why they would be integrating in the first place. And of course, we have some advocates, advancing these ideas, two of which like Jean Monnet or Robert Schuman, for instance, or Paul Henry Spark, all right, the other guy. But, the basic general reasons to be followed, for instance, is that first, the willingness to quit protectionism and trade war, because one of the reasons why they went into the war, the first one especially, and the Second World War, is that it has something to do with economy, because they have been very competitive one another. They post like unbelievably like difficult trade barriers. They're not supporting each other in terms of the trade relations, and then that eventually created sort of like hardship in some countries, giving birth to poverties, for instance, like in Italy, in Germany even. And then later on, this situation was capitalized by politicians with, let's just say, evil intentions. We have that guy from in Germany, for instance, the Führer, and then we have other guy from Italy, and so on and so forth, being able to mobilize people, believing in like social inequality, believing that some social structure needs to be readjusted, so to speak, and then that accumulated with other social issues have become the very foundation of these nations going into the war, for instance. And then other reasons would include a disposition toward chauvinism and exclusivity, demonstrated constantly since like 16, 17 years. I mean, the century, 17th century, 16th century in Europe, they feel to be the best. They feel like they should be the one having more, colonization land. They feel like they need to rule the world and the language needs to be spoken more, and so on and so forth. So this kind of feeling makes them feel exclusive, resulting in a very unhealthy competition leading to the war, for instance. They have also as well external factor. Don't forget about the United States of America as the main trade partner of the European nations. So after the war, when the US sees that the market is collapsing in there, the building, the economy, the social well-being of the people cannot be relied upon any longer, for instance, and the United States feels the need to intervene, by building the economy, building the political system and whatsoever. And because of that reason, they support the idea of European resurrection, so to speak, by having like German and France sitting together with other nations, now cooperating, not fighting, and they need to be in a cooperation on something that they've been fighting over and over for the past like 100 years. That is coal and steel, which are natural resources at the time, very important for weapon creation. So they've been competing, getting like regions or getting like locations or cities offering this kind of natural resources because they want to extract the resources and build their weaponries the best they could. And if you wish to do so, then you need to have like conquered these regions producing these natural resources. And that's the very reason they um, like combat each other, like occupy, like colonizing like neighboring lands or any lands that is offering this kind of resources. So philosophically, the United States and other states, Robert Schuman as well, other figures think, you know what, France and Germany have been fighting like for years. Let's just have something more interesting. Now you guys are cooperating under the things that you've been fighting for before. That's just gonna be very unique, okay? And other external factor, of course, we have ideological interests of the United States. When you see like European countries like were defeated in the war, like, and they're being like very weak economically speaking, social wise, and at the same time we have Soviet Union rising as the European power at the time. So Soviet Union, as we all understand, was defaulting to communism, and it is in their very best interest to have the communism spread it throughout the world, especially in Europe. And some of these countries are directly neighboring like the Soviet Union. So that's why the United States was quite worried, and they think we need to intervene, right? And then when they hear about this sort of like political projects from Benelux countries, including France, for instance, as well, that they want to revive the idea of pan Europeanism, and they want to have like the neighboring countries engage, getting together and integrated to avoid all those problems that have been delivering them to the war to begin with in the first place. And the United States was completely all over the moon, was completely on board with that particular plan. Okay. And there's also, don't forget about German. Like German is like a very scary country in the past, as you would know. It's like Japan. And if you see the method there is that the victors of the war want that these countries, the belligerent countries, they want these countries to be weak like forever, to be stripped out of their military capabilities, to be ensured that they're never going to reach the power they had reached in the past that turned them into this kind of very evil belligerent countries, and to ensure that they would never have the ability, they would never have the opportunity to be able to transform into that country again in the future. So what they would do, these fictures countries, is that they would design a system to weaken these countries, to sort of like avoid them from having the capabilities and the capacity to develop themselves into a military might again in the future. Like what they do in Japan, for instance, like they are introducing the Article 9, one of the most controversial article in terms of national ideology, or in terms of national bill is concerned. We have that Article 9 that has been reformed or wanted to be reformed by a lot of Japanese politicians. But again, Article 9 has been very useful up to these days to make Japan sort of like a toothless tiger, so to speak, right? And the same thing happened here, quite the same, quite similar, that they want German to be a democratic country, not caring anymore about military development and not having aspiration anymore to conquer Europe and the world. Okay, not one time, but two times, from the First World War and the Second World War, and seeing their ability, the level of intelligence, their culture, and so on and so forth. Like it's very possible that German could be militarized again in the future. So they tried to instill German into a system that would prohibit German and the Germans, I mean, from doing so. And that's why they have this like European Union integration project where they demilitarized German. They're not allowing German to have nuclear, for instance, and um, all you need to do is just to cooperate in coal and steel, okay, which later created the European coal and steel community. Okay, now the evolution of the European integration. When we talk about the European integration, as I would tell to a lot of people, that sometimes, more often than not, we only care about the Maastricht Treaty. Okay, this treaty was signed in 1992, 1991, 1992, but it was really really the treaty that created the European Union. So rightfully so, when you talk about European integration, then we are talking about European Union, and a lot of people would just care on Treaty of Maastricht, right? That is the renowned treaty. That's the most famous one because it is really the treaty that installed or created the European Union. But what most people forget is that the European Union that we have today, or that even what we have in 1992, has been a result, has been a product resulted by a very long series of journey, a very long series of cooperation, constant communication, constant attempt by some European leaders and figures to have the integration idea intact, and not withered away by over time or over any issues or problems they faced during those times they're trying to integrate Europe even more. So as I mentioned before, if you think about the evolution of the European Union, you might think about Treaty of Maastricht, but please, if you understand comprehensively, then we need to go back, all way back to 1951, when the Treaty of Paris was agreed, okay? And the treaty created the European Coal and Steel Community. And this has been really the organization that eventually developed into the European Union. So as you can see, we have Treaty of Paris, and then we have Treaty of Rome 6 years later, which created the European Economic Community. So as you can see, from 1951 to 1957, it wasn't it was only like 6 years until they realized that their integration project is working. So they're trying to expand it from coal and steel community to something more overarching. Let's say before it was coal and steel, now we're talking about economy. Now we have economic community, and that was from Treaty of Rome. And they also expanded to talk about Euratom. And then they have the Emerge Treaty in 1967, which created the most important one, which is the European Community, or the ECE, the EASY, like if you read the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union or Treaty on the European Union, for the most parts, those articles laid down in those treaties have been already articles of the European Community. Much of those articles inspired by, or at least taken from the articles of the European Community, because really the European Community has been the co-foundation that later on, right, through Single European Act, they have like multiple more integrated cooperation, including the idea of having the Eurozone, for instance, and then later on is the Treaty of Maastricht, followed by some other next treaties, that really turned the European Union into a successful international integration project. So if you could see, the evolution here is involving quite a number of treaties, actually, not only Treaty of Maastricht, but also some other treaties, as you could see on your screen. All right. So, what is the European Union? What is the European integration? I would like to give you like the academic definition of it, written by at least Professor Chin in Boregan. It's a regional organization of European liberal democratic countries agreeing on political and economic cooperation through shared institutions and collective decision making. So, if you see this very basic definition, then you would understand it has no quite striking difference, so to speak, with the decision of a small community of a nation getting together with some other small communities, other nations, and creating states. You know, there is the basic, there's some basic elements being present in there as well, like shared institution. They decide to have like collective decision making, and they have like civil political units or bodies to help them dealing with their daily lives or problems, or simply to help them advance even more as a community. So they decide, they realize the idea of having a corporation may do something good to them, and that is why they decide to have the collective decision making. Okay, now this is the member of the European Union. Please excuse, there's still the United Kingdom is there in there, but the idea is that now we don't have the United Kingdom anymore, but other member states are still in there. Do we have Croatia? Yeah, we already have Croatia in there. The latest member, yeah, I think Croatia has been the latest member states of the European Union. The latest member being accessed was Croatia, okay? And then the United Kingdom leaves, okay? And this is the, those of you not coming from Europe, or those of you not really paying attention of the whole mapping situation in there, here you go. We have this European nations located very closely to each other, not closely like we're close, for instance, to Malaysia, but you know, it's just like really far away. Like we need to take an airplane, for instance. We need to like drive for several hours, and not every region is connected, but we can have European countries really sitting next to each other, so to speak, right? If we and of course it's also a large area. For instance, you cannot like walk from the Netherlands. It's just a small region. I'm just gonna walk from Amsterdam to Berlin. Then you're not gonna do that. You're gonna end up in hospital, for instance. But the idea of them being like very separated, like the way we are separated here from even from South Sulawesi to Papua, is just outstanding, right? We have like a very huge distance from one another, and that particular distance is not really happening within the context of the European Union, right? So how does the integration work within the European Union? Basically, if we want to simplify things, we only need to look at two dimensions. I believe my time is like very I don't know, I don't think I have time anymore, but I'm just gonna try to cover everything from now on. How does the integration work within the European Union? Basically, let's just simplify things. We only need to do two things. First of all, they eliminate sovereignties on designated fields of cooperation. Once they decide that they want to cooperate in this particular field, then they decide, okay, let's just give up our sovereignties in there, meaning our states cannot be intervening in that particular fields anymore. Why? Because those fields are now the domain of the European Union. That's why if you look at the red box, the second phase is that they are creating international body that has supranationalism within that very body, and this body is tasked to oversee the cooperation. Now, we have international organization, and then we have supranational organization. International organization means just a bunch of states decide to cooperate each other under one organization. But this very organization is not taking over the sovereignties of these member states. You know, that's not happening here, because we have supranationalism, where the European Union member states decide to create some supranational organization, where this supranational organization is having more power, more than the states themselves, when it comes to several fields of cooperation. So that's how they do it. That's how they integrate. They decide to give up some cooperation, some fields of cooperation, so that they can cooperate even more. And the way they do that is that they appoint a referee, so to speak, to oversee the cooperation. And because they have appointed this referee, at the same time they also giving out sovereignties for this referee to do whatever they like, to discipline them when they are not doing things considered to be in line with the aims, with the aspiration of the cooperation in the first place. So the referee is there, and the referee is equipped with the ability to be higher than the state if the state is not cooperating. So I think that's the idea of supranational institution. The really question now is that which fields of cooperation they would do. Okay, again, for the sake of like simplifying things, I've put up this like very famous European Union pillars, but I want to make a disclaimer. This was like the old pillar of the European Union, okay? But just to build some very basic information, let's just take a look at these pillars first. You can see there's a roof there called the European Union, and under which we have three pillars: the one on the left-hand side, and the one in the middle, and the one on our right-hand side. Okay, now the European Union is working and cooperating, the member states, only on the fields of cooperation written on the left-hand side. What it means, the European Union has a full force authority to dictate states when it comes to cooperation on these very fields you're having on your screen. It includes customs union, internal market, joint agricultural policy, environmental policy, and so on and so forth. So the European Union, from its organizations, because we have like European Union, for instance, the European Commission, right? We have some other European institutions. So European Union is tasked to create a cooperation in here and to oblige the member states to cooperate in these very fields. And if the member states are not in conformity with the regulations made by the European Union for this cooperation, and then the European Union has every right to punish the state. Can you imagine, in the world of like the theory of anarchy, where it is regarded that there is no entity more powerful than the state, that the state have like very equal position. It is really the distribution of the capabilities and the capacities to meet the demands of the domestic people that really differentiate them within the international relations, international stage, or international world, right? But under this European Union concept, under this supranationalism, there is actually one entity higher than the states. That is the European Union. But it is very important to understand as well, the European Union is only higher than the state when it comes to the matters shared by the first pillar over there you see on your screen. But when it comes to the rest of the pillars, meaning issues regarding common and foreign and security policy, for instance, which is very sensitive, right? We're talking about foreign policy, we're talking about security policy, and so on and so forth. That's very, very sensitive for a nation. Or you want to talk about legal system within the domestic sphere of that country, cooperation in the areas of justice and home affairs, which are equally sensitive as well, then that is not the domain of the European Union. The European Union is not entitled to work on those pillars. Okay, now I want to return to my statement that this has been the old system of the European Union. Like, we have three pillars, and later on, this system, the whole thing got sort of like revised in Lisbon. Okay, and then we have like a new system here, basically the same, but now we have four. On the left hand side, you can see we have the exclusive competence, and those are the fields that have been really the domain of the European Union. The principle still applies. Like, if it comes to these very dimensions of cooperations, then the European Union is having like the only entity having a say, for instance, is like the European Union. But and then you move on to the second pillar, the second column there. We have 50-50, so to speak, and it also the same. It also applies to the rest of the columns as well. You can see there are some competencies that the European Union is given permission to exercise, with some exception, for instance, or with some exclusive member states. But the new regulation says from a Lisbon Treaty says that if the member states are proven to be unable to perform their competence in, for instance, providing health, dealing with culture, tourism, and then the European Union may overtake. So all I'm saying is that the old principle was like very loud and clear as to what the European Union could do, what the European Union couldn't really do. But again, the new system has been quite absurd and sort of like plays in a more grayish area, but it is really a benefit for the European Union, actually, because now the range of the domain of the European Union is extended. Now it's embracing more and more like fields of cooperation. Okay, so for instance, you can see in the second column there, right under the energy, there is area of freedom, security, and justice. Okay, and if you remember the old system, the area of freedom, security, and justice was located on the right-hand side of the pillar, meaning it's exclusive. There is no way the European Union is allowed to intervene in that system, But now, as you can see, now the area of freedom, security, and justice has been moved like to a new column where it is entitled there. It's not exclusive competence of the European Union, but it is regulated that if it has something to do with the European Union, then the European Union may intervene. Although the matter in question is about security and justice of the domestic system of the member states, right? For instance, for example, things relating to terrorism and security, right? It's the domain of security and justice, right? And it should be taken care by the member states because that's their sovereignty. You do not want to have foreign entities dictate how you should preserve your law, how you should punish your own citizens and people. But when it comes to terrorism, for instance, which has been really the concern of like international society, and again, the European Union is concerning about a number of security policy, and then terrorist situation has become the domain of the European Union. So if there is something that goes or intervenes with the interests of the European Union, rest assured the European Union is now, after Lisbon, after 2007, the European Union is allowed to intervene. Okay. So how do they integrate so far? Like the European Union has been regarded as the most successful integration project. And if you can see the idea of the nation state, and is it really working wonderfully within the European Union, we can see like the journey has shown us that the integration is not really that, it's not really that successful at some point. You know, as you can see, the first case is we have the case what we call European Defense Community versus Western European Union. So basically, these projects are military projects where the European Union member states wanted to expand their cooperation in the field of economy. Now that they're having like the same economic system, they have the same customs union where people, goods, services can like go around the territorial of the European Union without really facing any barrier whatsoever. Now they want to extend the success, and they want to also having an integrated military command. So they have the political bodies very successfully, they have the economic projects very successfully, and now they want to have a successful military cooperation as well. So that's why they propose it two times. The first one is the European Defense Community, right after even the European Coal and Steel Community was created. And the second one later on, I think during the 80s, they have the second project called Western European Union. They are of different names, but they are actually the same. Basically, the member state or some European leaders or figures feel the need to bring their states together again, now not only under economy and politics, but now under military command. What happened then? A lot of member states do not agree. The idea of having their national soldier be a subject of foreign entities, be a subject of foreign military command is really not appealing and entertaining to them. So they do not want to have that integration. Okay. Other case would include the empty chair crisis, as I explained before, like the goal being the European leader of like France, they disagree with the trajectory and the dimension of the European Union at the time, which was considered to be very overarching already. This protest went like this. We started to cooperate only in coal and steel community, and that is great. We have like integrated economy, but why do you want to expand it to other fields of cooperation? The more fields of cooperation exercised under this integration project, the least authority our states, our government have towards those fields. Okay, so basically during the 80s, 70s to 80s, there is a very growing power of the European integration project of the European Union, and some member states do not really like it, including like Charles de Gaulle being one of them. And eventually under his like administration, France decided not to leave the European Union, but not to cooperate with the European Union. So can you imagine like having a member states like as big as an influencer as France, and all of a sudden France didn't want to have anything to do with your project. So that's a bummer, and that's very disappointing. So the integration is really not that great if you see it from this kind of perspective. We have the bloody British question, like the United Kingdom is not joining the European Union right away after its creation. If you look at the founding countries, so to speak, of the European Union, and that list would not show you the United Kingdom or the British Empire as one of the founders. That's Why? Because the United Kingdom did not want to join the European Union from the very beginning. Okay, they only come to be a member of the European Union from 1973. And one of the reasons to explain this is that because the United Kingdom is always profit seeking. You know, when you create the European Union, right, there are some idealism as well that, hey, we are together as a European nation. We've spent like 300 years fighting each other while we have the same ancestors, we have the same skin color, we have the same like heights and posture, physical features. For instance, we have the same cultures to some extent. We don't necessarily speak the same language, but if you look at the roots of our languages, then we are actually speaking the very same language, and so on and so forth. So why don't we get integrate collectively together? You know, there is that philosophical foundation to support the creation of the European Union. But you know, the United Kingdom has never shared the same wisdom. As a matter of the fact, from the very beginning, they only try to join because they want the profit. You know, they want to have like the economic access and the economic benefits from joining the European Union, things that they did not really wish for during the 50s when the European Union was first created, because they were still having like their colonies. You know, they're still having like very harmonious trade relations with some regions outside of like Europe, let's just say Canada, let's just say Australia, or the Commonwealth countries for that matter. So they don't really feel the need to maintain sort of like economic relations with the European Union or European member states. But then again, fast forward in 1973, from there like two Harold, like especially Harold Macmillan as the prime minister, which is a Europhile, to be quite frank, they start to see that the future of the economy of the United Kingdom lies within the continent, especially, you know, with those guys having a powerful and influential trading bloc called European Community, still European Community at the time. So again, after getting in and on board, you know, the United Kingdom and the government will constantly ask, hey, what do I get from this? Hey, what do I get from this? You know, so that signifies the reality under which the United Kingdom is not really integrating. It's just they want to have the economic benefits, and that should sort of like ease the understanding years later when we have Brexit, when we ask why a country like the United Kingdom, perceived as one of the co-members of the European Union, is leaving the European Union. Because from the very beginning, they are not integrating, so to speak. We have common agricultural policy and social cohesion, which also disintegrate the member states in a number of fashions. You know, France is criticizing the common agricultural policy, and some other states are also, Germany, for instance, thinking, hey, I'm donating more to the European Union. Why is my donation going to Poland? Why is my donation going to Greece, Malta, or some other states under this social cohesion, under this common agricultural policy? And then what do I get from that? There's nothing. So it's really useless for me, for instance, to pay for the European Union. So we have that problem, and then we have European security defense policy versus NATO, where European countries, European member states prefer to have NATO as their security umbrella, as opposed to having their defense policy developed and built and militarized. You know, the idea is that they don't like Germany having a nuclear arsenal like in their country. If they want to be free from NATO, meaning they don't need NATO anymore because they already have reliable military organization, then they need to rearm Germany. France and the United Kingdom back then, and including the Netherlands, the Atlantic allies, does not like the idea. That's why they prefer to still choose European security defense policy. They still choose NATO, over European security defense policy. So again, we have EDC and WEU again here as a case in point, quite reflected in ESDP v NATO case. And then we have Brexit, of course. Long story short, United Kingdom is leaving the European Union because they don't feel the need of integrating anymore. They perceive their contribution is useless because their contribution, which is a lot because the United Kingdom is rich, that means the GDP is high, and that means the percentages of the GDP is high as well, and that very percentage is used to donate to the European Union. They feel like the donation is just not good. They don't feel they are benefiting out of it. And then most importantly, they feel that the European Union has been getting bigger, larger, and more powerful than ever. And they feel like the European Union is taking over the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. Okay, so that's why they leave. That's like the general situation, the general condition. Okay, so we have people who are actually retaining and defending their nationalism within the European Union as well, and they do not want to move forward because one reasons over another. For instance, in the military situation, I told you, in the CHIEP and the CAP, for instance, and those other things. And if you want to have like some figures when it comes to defending like European identity, nationalism, people that are inhibiting, so to speak, the integration of the European Union even more, or at least people preserving the identity, upholding it more than any other dimensions in social and political lives. And we could see like we have like, for instance, these 5 politicians who have been very renowned to be like focal figures in advancing and expanding their ideas of nationalism or their the European exclusivity, so to speak, right? So we can have, I don't know which one you're very familiar with, but I think Marine Le Pen and then Geert Wilders are among those 2 politicians who have been very, very known to be very focal in advancing the idea, to the point that, for instance, Geert Wilders needs to live in an undisclosed locations because he has been receiving a number of death threats, so that he needs to hide because apparently his mind and his political thoughts and thinking have been making some people really furious. Okay, but that's just like the consequence of having your voiced, having your opinion or having your thoughts voiced or shared. Okay, now nation states and the regions in the developing part of the world, I think if you want to have the integration like the one we have in the European Union, in my opinion, and in other, like a lot of people's opinion, it's going to be quite very challenging because developing states are really preserving our national identities, and that's very logical because we don't get the identities quite easily. We don't get our state quite easily. We have our national heroes fighting against the imperialism, spending lives and times and a lot of resources just to be able to come with what we have, what we call as Indonesia today. So when the idea of deleting, absurding, and not making the national border sovereignties and those kind of threats relevant anymore, I think they would be like people agreeing with these national heroes and their stances and the importance of national identities are going to be the very people standing up front to sort of like contest with the idea. Okay, so when you have the European Union wanting to sort of like, let's just say, to have their regions integrated, to have their borders eliminated, it's very difficult to imagine the same, for instance, because I'm from Indonesia and I don't know where you guys from. Like most of the students, I think, I'm from Indonesia. Let's just imagine having our borders deleted with the government of Singapore or Malaysia, for instance. If anything, we've been fighting with Malaysia over borders for what, like 3 decades. But the idea of national identities, nation states, and the borders are still quite firmly adhered and devoted by a lot of Indonesian or developing countries, people from developing countries. And then we also have imbalances in social structure, in economy, in education, in culture, making the integration project will be harder to achieve. You know, like if you want to integrate France, Italy, the Netherlands, Benelux countries, it's going to be quite, it's not easy, but it's not as hard as you would integrate Indonesia with some other regional countries. In ASEAN organization, we even have format called the Asian Five and the CMLF countries. You know, Asian Five meaning other than CMLF countries. CMLF countries meaning Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, because those countries are deemed to be having economic performances a bit less than these first 5 countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Brunei Darussalam, for instance. So already within the Asian, we have disparities in terms of economy. And I think even within these 5 states, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, like we definitely have some, let's just say, quite significant differences in terms of like economy, even social and political undertaking. So it's not to say that the European Union member states have more rather uniform situation, as we could see Germany and Spain are also having like huge differences. Not to mention now, if we are like comparing Germany with a country like Greece, Poland, or Malta, then you would have like, I think, very huge gap and imbalance as well between those countries. What I'm trying to say is that in Indonesia, our imbalances are multi-dimensions probably, and it's probably taking more years like to be able to sort of like have, for instance, our economy in Indonesia with Singapore the same, because we have like different social demography, different social culture, and so on and so forth, which makes like the integration and the attempt to make things uniform is twice as harder, twice as much, I think. We have also developing countries. Again, we're not developing, like we can never like leave the state of being developing, because we still have some very chronic like weakness and situation, like very silly as like corruptions, right? Like in Indonesia, we are like under a crisis in terms of like corruption eradication effort, because one of the most prominent organization has been quite weakened for the past months, according to the media, okay, and according to a lot of people. I'm just reading them. I don't want to have like troubles or problems saying that, but that's just the facts that we have. Like the effort from these young people trying to combat corruptions is like over the chart, and then we have like some powerful people, at least from what we have now, is trying to undermine that spirit and attempt and effort and culture that has been around actually for like 20 years or so. It's like really good news for a country like Indonesia, where corruptions were second to none like 3 decades or 4 decades ago. And then now we have this system in place. The system is currently undermined by a number of social issues and situations. Okay, so we still have these classic issues with us. We have corruptions, we have inefficiencies in terms of bureaucratic measures, bureaucratic procedures. We have like still unemployment high, very high level, I would say, especially under the pandemic and so on and so forth. So bottom line, we still have like a lot of issues. Developing countries are having issues on their own, and the idea of combining them all together with this very issue still intact domestically is just not it's just not making sense. It's not I think it's not something that we could foresee in the next coming years, I would say, in my opinion. So that's the problem. We have another dimension when it comes to nation states, nationality, developing versus developed states. These are some elements that I would like to compare. In developing countries, the concept of nation states are very strong, as opposed to the developing states. They don't really necessarily care more anymore about nation states. Some of this idea of nation and nation states involved idealism in the developing countries, and in the developed states they just don't care. The United States is open to any nationals wanting to stay there, and is perceived to be able to contribute to the society of the United States, right? So one of the green card policy is that to invite very talented people in terms of doing the business, technology, sports, for instance, as we can see all great tennis players come to the United States and eventually become the citizens, like very rich people, very smart people. I think Fortune 500 companies, when it comes to the United States, American companies, I think half of them were created by immigrants, including, for instance, like Google, where it was created by two immigrants, and so on and so forth. So they're just being pragmatic. You know, if you come here and contribute to our society in terms of probably taxes or money, then please, by all means, come. We're going to make it easier for you and for your visa application. But in the developing countries, we're always suspicious, right? Especially like Western countries. And these days we have like Tiongkok sentiment in Indonesia. Like, what are you doing here? You're a foreigner. Like, why are you coming to Indonesia? What do you want from us? And so on and so forth. Which makes sense if we look at the painful experience we had to endure in the past when it comes to colonization or something like that. Okay. And then we have pride versus taboo. We are like very proud people telling nationwide what is exactly our nation, right? What is our tribe, for instance, in Indonesia. But it's just something silly, I would imagine, probably taboo in Germany, to be able to have that level, the same corresponding level of pride when you talk about your nation's nationalism or your identity, you know, because that is really the root of chauvinism they go through in the past. Okay. Then we have, like, again, protected sense. When you talk about nations, we are imagine, like we tend to portray like our identity as something that we need to uphold, that we need to protect. Like, we have a concept here in Indonesia, we call it harga mati or something like that, while in like advanced countries the sense of harga mati is rather worked on and not taught as a symbolic slogan. You know, like, if that is really important, harga mati, then let's work hard for our country, let's work hard for our identity, you know, something like that. But I think in Indonesia it's more like on symbolic front so far at the moment, I would say. And then we have traditional versus football pitch. I think when you go to developed states, the only reason they would like to sort of like show off their identity or nationalities, like when they go to some sporting events, for instance, like in a football stadium, where we have Germany, we have like France playing against what, under which match, under what competition, and there you would find like a lot of national flags, national symbols being like shown to people. But other than that, I don't think you would find that like symbols and those flags in our daily lives, with the exception of the United States, probably under the Trump era recently. But other than that, I think it's just not really that sort of like important. But in the developing states, identity is strong, pride, it's protected, and it's part of the element of the traditional wisdom, so to speak. It's important to understand people identities, and then later on having like like labeling or stereotype over the identity or something like that. It's a very useless thing, basically. And then we have in developing country, we have identity to be very ceremonial, something that we need to celebrate. When we are celebrating the Independence Day, like, then we're looking at some traditional national local heroes, and then we need to um, reminiscing, so to speak. And then when we look at developed states, of course, they are commemorating the same things with the same respect and level of enthusiasm. But more often than not, it's just about holiday discount, where you have like some cheaper price on your flight ticket or hotel room, and even in some restaurants. Okay. And we also start to have similar things here in Indonesia. Every Independence Day, we have a lot of like discounts, coupon in the restaurants, and I think, wow, that's an improvement. Okay. Do nation state obsolete? I would say, I would argue it's in the middle, like right to the, like, based on what I had discussed, especially when talking about the European Union. You can see the European Union is integrating closer than ever. There's no doubt about it, right? But when it comes to something serious, something like involves national meta, something that involves like national identity, or something about security and domestic foreign policy, they haven't been really that integrated. Meaning, states are still important to them. The currency is still important to them. The border at some point is still also important to them. So nations are indeed moving forward towards a bigger and more ambitious political projects. Again, the driving force within a state is the nations, and the nations are constantly moving forward. But the extent to which these nations, these people, wanting to move forward beyond the concept of a state, meaning like there is a united continent now, United States of Europe, for instance, um, is just like not definitive, I would say. And
Mr.
that should
Basit,
not leave us from uh,
Mr. Basit, I'm sorry.
yes.
Yeah, we are terribly sorry, but I'm afraid we have to cut you here because we will open the Q&A session soon.
Right. And luckily, that should be my last point as well. I think,
Okay.
uh, yep, that should be the last one. So thank you very much for your time, and your um, thank you very much for your time having my presentation. Now I should return the screen to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was such an amazing and very, very comprehensive presentation from Mr. Basit. Thank you so much, Mr. Basit, for the insightful materials. And as I mentioned before, now I think some of you will have some question to Mr. Basit, but I'm afraid we will only allow 3 students to ask some question or deliver your remarks for this session. So guys, if you have something to be delivered, you may click the raise hand feature, and after I mention your name, you may ask your question or remarks directly to Mr. Basit, and please make it quick. Okay. is there anyone who wants to ask questions?
We have Miss Anissa and Miss Sandra and Mr. Muhammad Alif. Can you see, Cynthia?
No, actually. I can see them.
Yeah, they raise their hands. Maybe we can start from Miss Sandra Natania.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, we can start from you, Miss Sandra, please.
Oh yeah. Hi, Mr. Ahmad. So my name's Sandra. I study tourism at Diana University. So what I'm gonna ask is that what makes or defines nation? As in Indonesia has tons of tribes, cultures, and way of living, ethnic groups, the races. I think so. As you said before, so does that mean that all of us have different nationalities? Even though probably all of us here identify as Indonesian. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. Mr. Basith, would you please answer the question, please?
Yeah. Okay. So what identify us as a nation? Actually, um, that is a very debatable subject in this kind of field, because even as mentioned before, like as Renat would write, for instance, nations are is a construction from the people sharing some similarities, for instance. But again, some of these similarities cannot be held responsible and cannot be regarded, so to speak, as as the similar traits that eventually make us as a nation. Because, for instance, language, right? Language can be very political. You say like a nation is people of a community sharing the very same traits, similarities in terms of background and races and probably language. But again, if you look at this uh, 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 if you look at these elements one by one, take a very, very good look closely, then, for instance, even if we speak the same language, the question is, like, which one occurs first? Is it the language or us deciding to form the community? Okay. You can say, like, for instance, Papuan people speak Bahasa Indonesia, but that is a result as a constant and systematic policies from Jakarta to make them speak Bahasa Indonesia. Now we're talking about having the same language, but are we sharing like the same nation and identity, for instance? Or you can say someone is like, we are of the very same nation because we share like race, for instance. Like, what makes you think like goats in Normandies in France are of the same race? Like, how is it a person could claim that he's purely he's of like this blood and this blood and this blood in terms of ancestors are considered? So we have this a lot of like traits for us, and eventually like inhibit us from really understanding that we are truly one nation, especially in Indonesia. But I think for the sake of this material in this lecture, like just in the beginning of my slides, I tried to simplify it by saying like a country may consist of different nations, and you can like shallowly or like very easily, very casually identify nations based on those similar traits. But if you ask further, like, what is the definitive situation here, then it's still on the debate, I would say. So, but at least we can identify ourselves as nations under Indonesian Republic. That's the best we could do, because a state could be again consisting of multiple nations. Yep, I think that is the answer. That is the response. Thank you. Do we have another one here?
Okay, I think we lost Cynthia. Thank
Yeah, I
you, Ms.
think so.
Sandra. Next, we have Mr. Muhammad Ali Farhan.
Yes. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Okay. So, my name is Muhammad Ali Farhan. I am from International Relations of Universitas Diponegoro. My question is, so in regards to the European Union, well, as an Indonesian citizen, I of course noticed that ASEAN is, in layman's term or in bold term, European Union wannabe, so to speak. So, my question is, in your opinion, do you think in the near future, when everything has been settled, or maybe when a lot of the Southeast Asian countries has been turned into a developed country, do you think that the model of European Union, where we would sacrifice a little bit of our sovereignty in order to have a economic relations, or the other thing that European Union do you think that could be applied to the ASEAN? Because as of right now, there are a lot of conflict in Southeast Asia, but because especially in Myanmar, or in other or in like old conflicts like Rohingya, but ASEAN can't do anything because of the non-intervention principle. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alif. I've been thinking about it as well for quite some times. Like, just like for the sake of having like some wild hypothesis on it, and I think yes, I would say yes, not a resounding yes, but at least I want to be positive here and say yes for at least like three different reasons. The first one is yes, because why not, right? Like we need to think positively. And the idea of having like an integration regional wise, having the same currency, having the ability like to go around and enjoy everything in each country is just like, it's very tempting, and why not having that in the future as well. And second, most importantly as well, is that we are already doing it, not as comprehensive as the European Union, but at least now you don't need visa anymore to go to Southeast Asian countries, right? Like with the exception of some countries that are still requiring one if you want to stay for a longer period of time, or for certain objective or reasons as to why you come and visit those countries. Like it's for working, for instance. I believe in Thailand, like if you go there just for vacation, then go ahead, you can book a ticket now and you go there right away, right? But if you want to go there for working, like some business, or you're a journalist wanting to cover a story, something like that, then you need a permission for that. But again, the idea is that we have like the freedom already. Third, your hypothesis is that this will be happening. Will this be happening when we have become more advanced in the future? The idea to be able to give up some sovereignties cannot be achieved if you're not advanced, because there are some high level of philosophical stakes in there that cannot be understood by some hungry nations. Like if your daily foreign policy is still orientated towards making your economy better, then having the idea of integration is probably the least thing taking your concern. But if you have everything already, and then you are seeking for more efficient way in solving things in terms of cooperation, and also you have this idealism of pan-Europeanism in the past, and you have like philosophical matters, I think it's just about time to have the integration in place, just like what they're having now in the European Union. But in Southeast Asia, again, it's possible, but probably my educated guess would be would be rooting for something in the long run, not anytime soon, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Basit, for your answer. I'm really sorry I keep being kicked out from the Zoom. And now for the last question, we have Miss Anissa Antania Hanjani here. Miss Anissa, you may now deliver your question or remarks to Mr. Basit.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Basith. I'm so glad to meet you again in this class. It's my pleasure. So my question is this. Actually, I found something interesting in Twitter not so long ago. So it's about the history lessons that has been taught in Malaysia for like so many times. So if Indonesia has its own history lessons, they taught us about Majapahit, they taught us about Sriwijaya. In Malaysia, they they taught the same thing, like, but there is a different slight different things that makes Indonesian very very sensitive about it, because the term that they use is Malay Majapahit, Malay Sriwijaya, that makes them like, oh my God, they're going to claim another culture and heritage from us again, said the Indonesian. And it actually made me thinking, is it actual? Maybe I have a similar question to Alif, but a little bit different. I learned ASEAN since I was in school, elementary school, junior high school, and the ASEAN that I always write in my book is the ASEAN is the definitive, the structure, etc., but not why ASEAN is important. How to make us actually believe that ASEAN is important from start with the basics, from the study that from the lesson that we learn in school actually. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Now, Mr. Basit, would you please answer the question, please?
All right, but before that, I want to have a question to you. Like, who kicked you out of the Zoom? Like,
I don't even understand. I was being kicked out so many times.
that's very interesting. Okay. Anissa, it's really good to see you again. I hope you're doing well. Like, I remember you vividly in my classes as well. So thank you very much for coming to the program and contributing a question, for instance. Now to your remarks, some of your questions. First of all, you're right. I think when you connect your statement, Indonesia and with is it Muhammad Ali Farhan previously? I'm trying to say that I kind of forget what you said, but here's the thing. When you want to, that's why I think we need some very advanced nation to be integrating to begin with, because in order to integrate, as I told you before, we need some high level or emotional stability, not to think about some historical past being taken by other state, which is very quite intriguing, for instance, because if we learn the history, we really shared the lands and the history with Malaysian people. That's why when you take a look at the Indonesian map that I showed you before, I started from Sumatra because I wasn't talking about a place. Basically, I was talking about the nation inhabiting the island. And there you go, we have Malayu people. Now we understand that nations can go to two different states. In this case, we have Malayu people living in Malaysia, and we have Malayu people living in Indonesia. And that is no surprise that you have the same nation, same ancestors, the same way of seeing things and blood and everything, now is claiming the same culture, because that's been happening for centuries in the past. As a matter of fact, if you look at in a much more broader sense, the kingdom like Sriwijaya, for instance, reigning 600 years, and it's not only about Indonesia in an actual sense of Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Like the region of Sriwijaya was really embracing as far as like Thailand, Philippines, the modern days, even like South China Sea, to certain area of that location. So the idea that they would have the same things with us and they claim it and then we get angry, this just shows some emotional immaturity, in my opinion, as opposed to like having it looking at it very closely and learn why they would claim such things, because they also have batik. They call ayam as ayam. Like if you see language is a political construction, then would you want to protest over ayam? Like would you be mad over ayam? Like I think that's the least thing you would do. So that's the first thing. And the second thing about ASEAN, the importance of ASEAN, we have to be fair about ASEAN to begin with. Okay, first, I think I'm not an expert on ASEAN, but I studied ASEAN also because I compare regions when it comes to integrations. For instance, I would like to compare European Union with African Union, with Mercosur, for instance, and ASEAN, of course. Not really interested in ASEAN, but I think in order to treat ASEAN better, we need to treat it with fair first. ASEAN, I think, was only transformed into sort of like functional regional organization, like what, like 20 years ago, like 50. My point is that it was created in 1967, but it was there only as a political project, for instance, to tame the sphere of communism, not to mention it was like inspired by like specific figures like Mahathir Mohamad or Suharto, for instance, or some Asian leaders at the time. So when these leaders are gone, the ASEAN fate and future cannot be really that bright anymore. It wasn't later until the Asian countries and Asian communities decide to make use of ASEAN, and it gives birth to the ASEAN principle or something like that. So, I think it's quite unfair to be hoping ASEAN to play very like important role these days, being that it's fairly still a new sort of transformed organization. Okay, especially with the pandemic, for instance, like ASEAN is deemed to be doing nothing, to help the people in the region, so on and so forth. Highly criticized. Some people criticize that, for instance. But I think ASEAN has a good future as long as like the people realize that ASEAN is important. Then ASEAN will be something in the future. Again, the decision, the destiny of the political project depends on the nations willing to move forward or not. So we're not talking about ASEAN per se, we're talking about the states. The decision of Indonesia to be intact as a country in the future depends on the dynamics of the nations within the Indonesian territory, wanting still to give up their sovereignties and appoint the Indonesian government as their guardian of the territory, them being the population. And the decision of making ASEAN important or not depends on the nations within the Southeast Asian region willing to make it important or not. I think that's really the question. Now, do we have that or not? Maybe now it's really not that important in our daily lives, but maybe probably in the future, hopefully. I think that's the whole thing.
Okay, so much if I can borrow the constructivist concept, if one day we want to ASEAN to integrate, we have to adopt the moral value like the whole, right? So that we can make the integration come true.
Yeah, I think the ASEAN community and the executives need to construct more social foundations under which we can find our similarities, for instance, in which we want to invest more. And in that way, we can deem ASEAN as significant and important. But you're correct when you highlight the constructivism, meaning social reconstruction here, and that's important.
Thank you for your explanation.
Thank you so very much.
Okay, I think that's all the materials and answers from Mr. Basith. And thank you so much, Mr. Basith, for becoming our speaker today. And
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, now we will have some photo session. So everyone, please turn on your camera and I will count from 1 to 3 so the operator can capture the screen. Okay. All right. Okay, now. The operator, are you ready? Okay. We're going to start. 1, 2, 3. Okay. One more. 1, 2, 3. Okay. All right. I think that's all. And now, well, I'm sad to inform that this is the end of today's session, but tomorrow we will have more upcoming session with amazing speaker as well. I'm going to give you a brief explanation about tomorrow's session. In the first session, we will have Mr. Nehemia Cesare as a graduate of International Relations, Diponegoro University, and now he is currently working as a professional coach for a project called Coaching for Life by Safe Children Indonesia, together with the Arsenal Foundation, aimed to build character and mental resilience for children. His session will provide us knowledge regarding many aspects and dimensions of international relations. One of them is child right, quality education in social disparities. And other than that, we will also have cooking workshop with Miss Larissa Amelinda, where she will share her recipe for chicken curry. And the operator, may I ask to share the, yeah, okay. So this is the ingredient of the dish that we are going to cook tomorrow. And if you guys are interested to try it at home, you may screenshot the screen and you can prepare it for tomorrow. Okay, thank you so much, operator. Yeah, and I'm sure tomorrow will be fun. So that wraps up everything. And thank you again, everyone, for coming to our session. And after this, you may leave the meeting and we'll see you again tomorrow at 11 a.m. per usual. So do not forget. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Mas Basith. Thank you,
Thank you,
Mas Indra.
Sir. Thank you,
everybody.
everybody. Bye.